Continuing paths revisited by Constantino, Chapter 8, Restoration and Rebellion, presented by SUÑAZ and VASQUEZ. The victory of Manuel Rojas and his Liberal Party in the elections of 1946 was a triumph for the forces of restoration. But while the pre-war elite were now assured the political and economic power which had been theirs before, the Japanese invasion restoration could not take the form of the simple resumption of the pre-war order after a period of suspended animation. The biggest factor was the changing role of the United States. In the world, the United States emerged from the war as the major world power with dual their goals. America's economic and strategic preoccupation were immediately reflected in her policy toward the Philippines. The restoration was therefore the replication of the colonial order in a different way. The flag independence of the Philippines was to receive in 1946. Trauma of 1921. Post-American policy was essentially a reflection of continuing concern of American business and its spokesmen in government to avoid a repetition of traumatic economic depressions of 1921. It was aimed at anti-capitalism, England and Western European countries, and at the underdeveloped nations. The earlier objective of U.S. policy was therefore to subdue rivals among the developed nations, to displace England, and to effectuate the conquest of the heights of finance in the country. Toward world hegemony. The integration of Germany and Japan into his world capitalism soon became economic necessity and was to prove useful, particularly in the case of Germany, as a level in overcoming Western European. The goal of world hegemony required that United States defend and sustain capitalism. Anti-communism became the ideological rationale for this economic objective, although at the time revolutionary movements did not pose a major threat. New democracies in Eastern Europe was perceived by some American policymakers as a dangerous expansion of Russian power which must be contained at all costs. American propaganda created the Cold War, which provided the United States with the excuse of interfere in the internal affairs of nations, especially the weaker ones, bolsters reactionary regimes, and build a network of military alliances for defense against the Lebanese. From containment to liberation, the victory of Chinese communists in 1949 and the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, American paranoia intensified and the policy of containment was transformed in one interversion. The rise of Foster Dulles represented the triumph of that sector of American policy that stood for a more activist stance in world affairs. He became Secretary of State in only 1953. He was an active participant in the evolution of foreign policy. From colony to neo-colony. Development of American policy in Asia and its particular application of the Philippines during the same period transformed the Philippines from a colony to neo-colony. The men continued dominant of the economy, its retention as market for American goods, a source of raw materials, and an open field for American investments. Filipino accepted American rules to impose the colonial framework with hardly any objection, with a little understanding of its consequences. Philippines became independent without the intellectual and attitudinal equipment to sustain that independence. When the Stars and Stripes were held down during the inaugural ceremonies on July 4, 1946, most Filipinos will promise their future on dependence on the United States. Confluence of interest. Filipino leaders become pawns in American power game, and for other sectors of the elite to promote their interests to a return to the pre-war class sectional based on American independence in the name of economic rehabilitation. Filipino agricultural exporters was haciendar and mills has been destroyed, expected rehabilitation and restoration of the pre-war trading relations. This was the background of developments during the Rojas Quirino administration. MacArthur's maneuvers had made Philippines safe from these American machinations and prepared the country. Options of Rojas. Starting the country off a new basis, Rojas assumed office at a time when conditions were boisterous. The pre-war economy based on a lopsided trading pattern was in shambles. The political system had been shaken up. Many of principal collaborators belonging to the pre-war leadership were still under detention, and a new non-traditional and fairly strong coalition embodying the aspiration of the broader sector of liberals, laborers, and peasants had entered the scene, demanding an end to colonial relationship. Education, political record, and ideological preference committed to him to this position. Rojas solutions. He was convinced that the Philippines could not survive, much less rehabilitate its economy without American and investment. In his view, everything depended on American financial assistance. rapid growth of ultra-radicalism, which he regarded essentially an economic problem. His solution in brief follows. He would use as grants or loans to finance the reactivation of the private corporations, increase production with lower prices, with lower of unemployment, there will be less radicals. Frustrations of an ally. Rojas' initial request for Americans' financial assistance were for an outright grant of the budgetary loan of $225 million in 5 yearly installments and $1 billion loan at 1.5% interest for 30 years. All his requests were dismissed or drastically reduced. He got nothing from the Export-Import Bank and UNRRA. The Gray Eminence. American response was a shock to Rojas and fatal for his liberation program, but did not change his course, and he continued working for American assistance and redoubled his effort to enlist the support of Americans who might be able to help him. His closeness to the Americas were underlined by the fact that his principal speechwriter was U.S. Navy Commander Julius C.C. Edelstein. This period was the United States was laying down the foundation of real colonial control, and Rojas himself was using all the powers and resources at his command to adapt the country for this framework. Bell Trade Act. The Bell Trade Act was passed by the U.S. Congress in October 1945. Its basic objective was the continuation of free trade between the two countries, which would otherwise terminate with Philippine independence. Bell Act also deprived the Philippines of its currency sovereignty by fixing the rate of exchange at 2 pesos to $1 and providing that this rate should not be changed without U.S. approval. Parity, equal rights. The most onerous provision was the Equal Rights or Parity Amendment, which obligated the Philippines to grant U.S. citizens and corporations the same rights as Filipinos in the exploitation of Philippine natural resources. The electoral triumph in the Philippines of a pro-American leadership committed to a revival of the colonial economy and the military agreements the United States subsequently forged with this leadership were sufficient guarantees of a favorable climate for U.S. cooperation. The inclusion of the parity clause may be viewed as an instance when the official position representing business interests in general had to give way to the demands of the given sector, which for the particular period wielded greater political influence. The McNutt Connection. Sen. Millard Tydings sponsored the Bell Bill in the Senate. He was the real author of the Bell Bill trade. Bell was the congressman from Missouri, the home state of President Harry S. Truman. War Damage Blackmail. Trade Relation Act, approved by the Philippines Congress anticipating spirited opposition. The Philippines Rehabilitation Act offered the Philippines $120 million for reconstruction of highways, port, and harbor, etc., and other property losses and damages suffered by Filipinos, American citizens, religious, and private organizations. Constitutional Amendment. The Philippine Constitution provided that Filipinos should own a 60% share in all corporations. Therefore, the Constitution had to be amended to accommodate party. The Democratic Alliance conduct an energetic campaign against the Bell Trade Act. For Rojas, the Bell Trade Act was the key to the rehabilitation of the country. Had to exercise every stratagem at the command to obtain 3/4 rule. The maneuvers. The administration charged much voters had been coerced and that therefore the results were not reflective of the particular will. The plebiscite. The parity amendment still had to be approved by the people in the plebiscite, and once again Rojas virtuously took the campaign trail. Fear that this country is not going to be exploited. The opposition. Politically and ideologically, these forces of protest constituted the most militant opposition to Rojas. During the elections of 1946, the Democratic alliances had raised the issues of collaboration against Rojas. Terror and unleashed. During the election campaign, Rojas had promised that if elected, he would settle the peace and order problem in Central Luzon within 60 days. First policy against the Hawks and the PKM. The new president launched a mail and at the same time He entered into negotiations with their leaders in an attempt to get them surrender their arms, but the terror unleashed on the peasants by the central and provincial government loomed in negotiations from the start. Rojas' victory, landlord of Central Luzon, saw the victory of Rojas as the chance to destroy the mass peasants movement we regarded as their mortal enemy. Military police raided Hak barrios, arresting and torturing suspected lawless elements and shooting others. Military police and civilian had killed more than 500 and peasant leaders had jailed or tortured 3 times that number.
Landlords and loopholes. In an attempt to defuse the situation and attract the peasantry, Rojas had set up an agrarian commission to study the tenancy problem. By the end of June, the commission submitted its report, which recommended a 70-30 crop sharing formula, which is said to be the 70% share is for the tenant and the remaining 30% share is for landlord. But the landowners attacked the proposal with the support of PKM. With a convenient loophole, landlords backed by their civilian guards coerced their tenants into signing 50-50 agreements with crop expenses paid by the tenants. On August 17, Mateo del Castillo and Luis Tarroc presented a memorandum enumerating their minimum demands which were not acceptable. Towards a break, the Hawk leaders had been noticing the disquieting intensification of activity by military police and civilian guards. Checkpoints were being established along the highways. On August 22, military police began shelling barriers and conducting mass raids on suspected Hawk strongholds. The government claimed the involvement of the Hawks for what happened on the same day of August 24. The battleground. Central Luzon now became a battle zone as the government declared war on the Hawks. Here they settled all scores with a vengeance. Many MPs and civilian guards harbored a strong hatred of the Hawks. And because of what happened, it resulted in loss of lives, farmlands destruction, raids, and disappearance of others. Reactivation of peasants. After the hardships, they should want peace and to recover quickly, but it is not easy to the whole barrio people. The objective of the government drive was to isolate the Hawks from the masses, and from August to November 1946, the government sustained its offensive, which were purely defensive on the part of the Hawks. Hawk expansion. As the Hawk expansion started in September 1946, the organizations were soon established in Bataan and Zambales. They decided to shift from a tactic of evasion to an intensified, widespread, offensive to defensive form of struggle confined to small hit-and-run ambushes. The Hawks directed propaganda appeals to constabulary soldiers to fight against their common oppressors and not to fight against his own countrymen. Hawk demands. In an interview conducted by James Halsema on February 2, 1946, Luis Tarroc listed such demands from Hawks, but the Hawks could have anything but the slimmest hope that the government would meet their demands. Government response. The offensive as a government response made the Hawks intensify their own military activities, which resulted to incidents that were excesses on both the Hawk and government sides. The Labor Front. As the result of a trade union division, it was the establishment in 1945 of the Committee on the Labor Organization, later renamed Congress of Labor Organizations, that gives a great contribution in the Philippine economy. The CLO combined economic demands with political action and was active in the Democratic Alliance. It called on the workers to combine the struggle for concrete economic demands with the struggle for general political demands. Political action. On its 6 years existence, CLO was subjected to all kinds of harassment, and the officials in the provinces began to be invited by the PC for interrogation. Economic deterioration. The Philippines experienced a big crisis such as increase in prices of the goods and increase in unemployment rate in 1948. Prevalence of corruption. Rojas pinned his hopes for stronger economy but undercut his own stated objective of diversification by placing Jose Yulo in charge of setting priorities for loans and appointing Primitivo Lovina as RFC chairman. Assumption of Quirino. When President Rojas died, Quirino had promised to restore the people's faith in government, and peace in Central Luzon would be the first big step. The negotiations. Though the PKP leaders were skeptical that the talks would yield any concrete results, they had to enter into negotiations because by refusing to do so, they would be placing themselves on the defensive, since Quirino could then charge that the Hooks did not really want peace. Breakdown of negotiations. However, the promises which Judge Quirino made were not carried out. That leads into disappointment and the suspicion to Quirino that foreign pressure was exerted to make him desist from proceeding the negotiations. The battlefronts. At this moment, repression was far worse than it had been under Rojas, and Hooks were now convinced that to achieve their goals, they must overthrow the government by force. From Hukbalahap to Hukbong Mapagpalaya ng Bayan. As the HMB Army grew in size, a more orderly organizational structure became necessary. The rebel force grew rapidly between 1946 and 1948, and their expanding mass base convinced them that there was a heightening flow in the tide of revolution. From parliamentary to armed struggle. At this point, the PKP parted ways with a majority of the Democratic Alliance leadership. The latter rejected armed struggle and continued to place their faith in the parliamentary process. With the bulk of its mass based on active rebellion, the DI disintegrated. Nationalist articulation. As the Democratic Alliance receded from the political scene, nationalist articulation began to be taken over by Claro, M. Recto, and Jose P. Laurel. Their nationalism was still narrow and backward compared to the positions the Democratic Alliance had taken. The revolutionary situation. The PKP leadership had come to the conclusion that a revolutionary situation existed. They based their conclusion on the deep antagonism that the masses felt toward the government because its repressive policies and its failure to carry out agrarian reform.